get the thing straight once and for all. The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve disorder.
Hi, everybody. I know what you're saying. You're saying, Sean, it's May 1st. There isn't a new episode due for 2 weeks. Well, yeah, I know, but remember in episode 4, I said I needed to make an addendum to cover, well, my mistakes and omissions from episode 3? Well, here you go. Here is that mini episode of mistakes and omissions. But before I get into that, just a quick recap of episode 3. I discussed 2 12-inch records dedicated to Autoharp instruction. Autoharp for Students and Educators as presented by Dr. Nat Winston, and Tuning Your Autoharp with Meg Peterson from Oscar Schmidt International. Let's start with that first one, Autoharp for Students and Educators. Now, friends, I feel kind of silly. If you heard episode 3, you heard me say that I just couldn't find any information about Dr. Walter Duda, the editor of the record's instructional materials. Well, I merely had to look at the back cover of Autoharp for Students and Educators to learn more about him. So here goes. He earned his doctorate in music education at the University of Illinois. I mentioned that he was associate professor of music and the band director at Mississippi College in Clinton, Mississippi, but I failed to also mention that he was the director of music for the public school system in Urbana, Illinois, home of University of Illinois, by the way. And he was also director of music in Minonk, Illinois, about 120 miles southwest of Chicago. At the time the record was made, 1965 is what most references hint at, Dr. Duda was the counselor of music for the public schools of Cicero, Illinois, which is a western suburb just adjacent to Chicago. With that information, I Googled him with a couple of additional search terms and found that on October 29th, 1975, he directed the Singing Mothers of Cicero at the annual fall luncheon sponsored by the Bohemian Women's Civic Club. That's what they were called in the Berwyn Life newspaper, but they probably meant the Bohemian Women's Civic Club, but oh well. Interestingly, that benefit was held not in Berwyn or Cicero, but at Nielsen's restaurant in Elmwood Park. Go figure. And Dr. Duda was also involved in about a dozen or so professional and honorary organizations. You may also recall that I mentioned a 7-inch record existing, and well, I did my due diligence and found a copy on eBay. 2 problems, though. First of all, it was just the record. It didn't have the accompanying book, which a Google search shows that it might have actually been distributed by Sears. By the way, keep subscribing to this podcast and you'll be treated with some Sears stuff in the future. Also, the copy I found is not in good shape, and that's putting it nicely. At all. It's mostly surface noise, and it has some sticker residue in the playing surface, even after several go-rounds in my spin clean. The record does play all the way through, though, but it sounds so bad that I'm not going to bother posting it to YouTube or archive.org. Even with some digital trickery and cleanups, it still sounds terrible. But if I do happen to find a better copy, I will digitize it and upload it to both YouTube and archive.org. But I can tell you that little 7-inch record is basically a very compressed version of Autoharp for Students and Educators, except there are a couple of drop-ins of Dr. Nat saying that it's an introductory record, and he implies that the 12-inch version of the record is the complete course.
A more advanced course is available to teach other methods of playing, as well as relating the autoharp to the piano.
He also says to listen to that 7-inch record in its entirety before trying to play your autoharp. There are different pressings of the 7-inch record. The one that I have has that red label with the blue text that's very difficult to read, and it has a Nashville address on it. But there's at least one other version of it with a dark maroon or maybe even brown background, and it has gray text, and it's much easier to read and has an Evanston, Illinois address on it. There might be other variations, but I don't know for sure. Now, moving on to the errors and omissions from Tuning Your Autoharp. Well, first of all, I can tell you that my copy of Tuning Your Autoharp, which has the black and white version of the cover but with Meg Peterson's picture on the back, is from 1973. How was I able to determine that? After I recorded and published the episode, Just out of curiosity, I looked at the runoff part of the record. That is the part of the vinyl at the very end of a side, that silent part when the stylus reaches the end of that record side. Runout areas usually have some kind of serial etching or a stamping, something to identify where it was pressed and all that good stuff. Well, in this runout area, at least on side 1, there's an etching of this code, MLP-6290A ARC. That's spelled ARC, by the way. 2-7-'73, so February 7th, 73. On side 2, that first A is replaced with a B, and there's no apostrophe in the date. That pattern of ARC plus the date tells me that this record was pressed by the Allentown Record Company, Inc. of Northeastern Pennsylvania, just as was the record I talked about in episode 4, Hear How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party. ARC etches ARC plus the date in the runout, so I'm assuming the date the record was actually pressed was that February 7th, 1973 in there. I believe that's a smaller record pressing plant, unlike, say, the big ones like the ones at Capitol and Columbia had. And those small record pressing plants were all over the place. So no matter where you were, if you needed a bunch of records pressed, you probably were able to send the master tape to somewhere relatively closely and have it done. Nowadays, though, record pressing plants aren't as common. They're mostly run by independent record labels for their own purposes. Fun, or maybe not so fun fact, if I understand correctly, because of strict environmental regulations, new record pressing plants cannot be built in California because it would involve the use of hazardous chemicals. I wonder if that means that our beloved records are infected with some nasty stuff. Ooh. Worth it? Maybe. But if you ever go shopping on Record Store Day and you get one of those special Record Store Day releases, you'll likely see that what you buy was pressed in Germany or the Czech Republic, because pressing plants in the United States are relatively scarce and their capacities might not be able to handle that kind of demand. Also, I said that my copy of Tuning Your Autoharp showed Oscar Schmidt International as being located in Summit, New Jersey. Whoops, it was actually Union, New Jersey, about a 15-minute drive east of Summit. I'm thinking that Meg Peterson, the narrator and autoharpist on that record, lived in Summit at the time, and I just got the two confused. In fact, I'm pretty sure she did. I think she mentions it in her blog. From what I can tell, by the way, Tuning Your Autoharp was the only record that Oscar Schmidt ever produced, but Meg told me that they did make a lot of tapes, usually to accompany their instruction books. And in fact, she even offered to hook me up with some of those tapes, but I said, nah, I just want to stick to records. Fun fact, by the way, and this is a fun fact, next month, Meg will be celebrating her 96th birthday. She told me she's looking forward to being 96 because, well, 95 wasn't a good year for her. So that's all I had to say about, well, Autoharp Addenda. And one more thing. I mentioned in the episode that there were 11 notes in the Western musical scale, well, chromatic scale, I should say. Well, that's only partly true. There are actually 12. I don't know how I messed that up. I have a good grasp of music theory, but hey, you have A through G and then 5 accidentals or sharps or flats in between. So yeah, sorry about that. Anyway, just a reminder that you can reach out to me via email at myweirdrecords@fab4it.com, fab4it being spelled F-A-B, and then the number 4, and then I-T. The website for this podcast with helpful links and show notes for each episode is at myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. I'm on various social media platforms, including Twitter and Instagram, under the handle MyWeirdRecords, and on YouTube at youtube.com/@MyWeirdRecords. Thanks as usual to Tim Christ for letting me use his record, The Pac-Man EP, as the basis for this podcast's logo. You can check out Tim's excellent work on the web at worm-quartet.web.app. Also, many thanks to the talented and generous Kevin Zerb for designing the logo for this podcast. You can check out Kevin's music and podcasts at zerbinator.com. Given that it is May, I had a couple of things in mind for episode 5 due out 2 weeks from the day this is released. I mentioned that I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I have since decided. One of the records I was thinking of, I'm actually going to put off until May of 2026. Yep, I expect this podcast to last that long, and for a very good reason. You'll have to listen to that episode in 2026 to find out what that reason is. So instead, because the Kentucky Derby will be run a few days after this mini episode you're hearing right now is released, for episode 5, I will be talking about not just a record, but an entire game that contains 4 records, and it's called They're at the Post. If that title doesn't mean anything to you, trust me, it is related. In the meantime, this is Sean, reminding you to please support your local record store. Talk to you again in a couple of weeks, friends.
Did she wear a grass skirt, too?
Of course not. She was too fat.